Hello everyone, and welcome to our short series of blogs on disability and faith. We will be interviewing a variety of people who attend their local churches, have found community there, fellowship and acceptance. And above all, they've had the chance to deepen their relationship with Jesus. These blogs are all being recorded at this particular one. We're just slightly post-lockdown. We'll be speaking to Christians who have neurodiverse disabilities, physical disabilities, and hidden disabilities. So I do hope you enjoy these short blogs and that something really speaks to you. Now today, I would like to introduce to you the Reverend Bob Shrine. So Bob, and of course, sorry, to Lynn, his interpreter as well, who's very kindly come and joined us. So Bob, I thought as we start, whether you would be kind enough to share with us a little bit about your disability.
So firstly, I'd like to explain a little bit about my background, because I was born with normal hearing. My parents are both deaf. And I went to primary school. And at primary school, I realised that I was losing my hearing. It was a slow hearing reduction. And then I became profoundly deaf at round about the age of 35, which meant that my education was mainstreamed within a hearing school up to university and degree level. So that's a little bit about my background. Now I wanted to explain a little bit about my observations as I was growing up as a coder. So that's a child of deaf adults. So the first thing that I remember when I was from being really, really small was that my mother's family and their attitude towards deafness was very, very negative. And when I realised that I was becoming deaf, I tried to have conversations with my grandmother, and she said, "You're not deaf, you're just being lazy, you're not listening properly." So that made me kind of become a bit of an introvert. And in the end, I went to grammar school. So my mother's side, they had 2 deaf children out of 4. And one of the first ones was my uncle. And they were completely shocked. They just couldn't cope. And my grandfather left church and he never went back to church. And their attitude of deaf children was the same, that they should be the same as hearing children. So my mother's and their brother weren't allowed to sign at all. So they learnt sign language as adults. They were quite oppressed. They weren't allowed. They were forced to speak. And I can remember some of my uncles and aunts, the way that they used to speak to my grandmother, say, "Oh, I don't understand what she's saying. She's speaking terribly and she's speaking really poor." And I mean, at that time, I was only 6, 7 and 8, but I can remember that. And that was, that was my background. They were the things that I brought up. My mum was deaf. So sometimes it would have been better for her to say to me, they'd say, "Oh, they're deaf and dumb," because she couldn't speak, because their thought was if deaf people could speak, that they were higher up in the hierarchy of deaf people. And the thing that was really important to me that I realised growing up was that there was lots of deaf people who thought that hearing people knew best. And that became fixated in their minds. So hearing people knew best. So they would always go to the hearing world. But if my mum had any problems, she would always go to her father, which was my grandfather. She wouldn't go to my dad to ask for any help or anything. And it wasn't until the very end when I started going to Deaf Club every week, when I was about 14, 15, I was asked to interpret. And that's really strange because my parents used speech all the time. They were quite oral, so they mixed in the Deaf Club and they would sign there. And I mixed in the Deaf Club and I would sign there, and that's how I learned to sign. So then when I was about 16, 17, they used to say, oh, you can organise the trips, you can book the coaches for us. But then when I was 18, I went to university. I decided to kind of get completely shut the deaf world away for about 20 years. And then when I was about 33 to 34, yeah, so about 33 to about 43, roughly, about 10 years, within those 10 years. At that time, I got married. I had 2 children. And then I got divorced, we separated. And then within that time, there were 2 important things that happened in my life. Both were parallel. One of the things was that I then became profoundly deaf. So I then saw myself as being disabled because I couldn't function in the same way that I used to be able to. I never used the word disabled, but I realised back then in the past that that was something that I was feeling within inside me, although I never used that term at the time. And also for that reason, I decided that it was time to work with deaf people. So I became a social worker with deaf people. I wasn't qualified. So I went back and got involved within the deaf community in the deaf world. So that was one thing that happened. And the other thing that happened at the same time was that I became a Christian. So those 2 things happened in parallel at the same time. So 2 of my really close friends explained to me about Christianity, and that completely changed my life around. I felt like my whole world had been tipped upside down, but it was almost like previously my world was tipped up the wrong way up, and I felt now it was being tipped the right way up. So the deaf people welcomed me into their deaf church. They showed me so much love. They were friendly. I just wasn't used to it. That wasn't what I was experienced when I was a child. So it was something that was a complete shock to me. So a few months after that, I got married to my now present wife. we got married and we had 2 children as well, who are now both grown up. And within my church, I was thinking about the deaf people and the deaf people within the congregation. And I was thinking, who is teaching them? Who are teaching the deaf people the gospel? Where's the encouragement for them? Where's the leadership for them? Who's feeding them spiritually? And then I felt like God was saying to me, come on, you stupid man. And it's you that I'm calling to do this. And I was like, really? Me? You want me to do this? So I went on training to become ordained, and I was ordained as a deacon, and that was when I was 53. I became a priest at 54, and then it was just a matter of questioning about going out to the people. So my parish church, and my wife used to interpret as well, or we'd get friends to interpret. So we'd have people that were learning to lip read or lip speak. So it was better than nothing, but we had to use all kinds of different ways. But then I became involved in the church. They were really, really friendly. So I was part of the leadership team for a year. I did preaching, I led services. So my wife used to interpret for me. And if she wasn't available, then we would book interpreters we'd book interpreters externally. So that way, that was a new experience for me. And also I had to learn Greek. But yeah. And also I did an O-level, yeah. I did an O-level in Lent. Oh, in Latin, sorry, in Latin. So that helped me with the Greek as well. It helped me with the structure and the grammar of how things were structured. Anyway, I then left college. I ministered for 2 years. I ministered in the deaf parish in Yorkshire, and I was there for 14 years. I then retired 7 years ago now. But more recently, there's been lots of issues that have really had a massive impact on me from when I became a Christian, because when I went to conferences or meetings and it came to prayer, nearly always somebody would come and say that God wants to heal my deafness and want to pray over me. And I'd be like, well, yeah, okay, go ahead. You can pray for me if that's what you want. And now, ever since then, I've never said that nothing happened. I wouldn't say that nothing happened. I would always say, I'm still deaf, but I'm not the same thing as I used to be, because I now realised that God has used, that God has answered lots of prayers, but not in the way that people were expecting. Because what I've learned to do is I've learnt my identity. So previously, I would say with my deafness, I was in an identity crisis. I didn't know whether I was part of the hearing community or part of the deaf community. And I would say for a very long time, I was sitting on the fence. And it doesn't sound much, but it was a huge thing for me at the time, trying to work out which community I belonged to. And that meant that I was in an identity crisis for such a long time. So that conflict got resolved. So they thought that they were praying for my ears, but actually what they were praying for was my identity. And God sorted that out, that I now have an identity. So I've decided that I'm a deaf person, and that is it. And that's my identity. And I'm happy with that. But the thing that's been different for me is growing up as a hearing person and then becoming a deaf person. So that's how that really impacted my faith. And the problem is that I researched a lot of the issues of healing, and I realised that there was a discussion, a written discussion about healing. And it's often not the way that deaf people see it. And there's other disabilities as well, other disabled groups within that. So people look at the disabilities and they see that as the thing that people want healing from. But I think we have two different words. So there's healing and there's a cure. So there's those two different words that people get mixed up. So if you ask for like a cure for blindness, then people get their sight. That's a cure. But healing is to do with the whole person. So I think disabled people can be healed, but without being cured of their disability. So I think that's something that not a lot of people get a grasp of, not a lot of people think about. They just don't understand it. They just think people with disabilities are happy to carry on. Like, I'm still deaf, and you know, if I wasn't healed, then I wouldn't be here today. So I do genuinely believe that God's made me deaf so that I could then go into deaf ministry and help other people. So during my ministry as well, we've had lots of issues with healing. So the other example is you've got a general issue that face all deaf people with Christian faith within the church. And the church look at disabled people and they think that they need healing. They think that everything's focused on them or their disability. And deaf people might say, I don't need healing. My life's absolutely fine as it is, thank you. I'm part of a beautiful language, I'm part of a deaf community. Why is it that hearing people think that we need healing all the time? But then that's true of lots of other disabilities as well. And that's been a lot of my experience through ministry, and that's where I'm trying to shift the viewpoint that people have. Because basically healing means that the person becomes different. So they might be deaf, they might be blind, they might be in a wheelchair. So it's to do with the adjustment of how they think and how the norm of how the society understands normal. So each of us adjust in different ways. So we're not all the same. But also we don't want people to become like us, because then that's oppression. So no deaf person can become a fully hearing person. It's impossible for that to happen, because they can't communicate clearly with speech, because they can't speak in the way that a hearing person would speak, because the language that they use isn't the same pitch. So I've learned a lot of that in my ministry. So I went to a hearing grammar school, I went to a hearing university, and I've learned, you know, there's different people with authority. So you think about people that were born deaf really rarely achieve going to college or going to university.
So, Bob, you have covered so much, but time is of the essence. So, but you've answered all my questions that I already had. But I wondered if in just one line you could, if you could give a piece of advice to a parish priest or to a deaf person who are thinking about a deaf person going to church, or a parish priest who had someone arrive at their church, what piece of advice would you give to them?
I think the first thing I'd say is to contact the National Advisory for Deaf Ministry, and she will know lots of contacts and different people that they can give advice, and signpost the deaf person where they can go for different pieces of advice should they need anything.
Well, thank you so much, and I'm sorry to finish it so soon, but just to try and keep these blogs quite short. But you've really shared so much there, so I appreciate that. Thank you, and thank you to Lynn for joining us. And also, you might have noticed my cat invaded the screen a few times, so I apologise for that.